So hey there friends, and welcome to this episode of SelfKind with me, Erica Webb. It has been a couple of weeks since I have recorded a podcast episode, and I am really looking forward to diving into this one with you. Today we're going to be talking all about the people-pleasing perfectionist's guide to self-care. All right, so I'm back. Took a couple of weeks off there. First time in a really long time that I've missed publishing episodes of this podcast. It's been running since 2020, and in that time, I could count on just a few fingers times that I've missed publishing an episode every week, sometimes even publishing a couple a week. And over the last couple of weeks, life got really lifey. Life got kind of hard. And the easiest way for me to make space for myself was to take something off my plate. And that something ended up being the podcast, which is interesting because it is one of my favorite things to create. It's one of my favorite ways to connect, but it also is quite time consuming because over the last little while, I've moved over to video podcasting, which, adds a second thing to edit. It means that I have to have everything set up so that it looks okay. The light needs to be right, all of that sort of stuff. And so as much as I love it, it's also one of those things that if you're looking to create time and space in your week is probably a good place to look. So that is why for the last couple of weeks, there has been no podcast episode. The other reason was because I'm in a new space. So if you are watching on the video, you can probably see that my rainbow books that are normally behind me are no longer there. And the reason for that is because I'm in a completely different room and the rainbow books have moved into a different room as well. So I'm in a different room. The rainbow books aren't where they normally are either. We're doing a huge rearranging of our house. And so I have now got a dedicated little podcast corner with foam on the walls for sound. And it's in the corner of the place where I film movement content. So it might look familiar if you can see it on video. And so that took a little bit of time too to get that organized. So between life getting a little complicated and moving the house around, we're finally back in action. And life getting complicated, I don't love just vague, comments of well, life got complicated. You're probably sitting there thinking, is everyone okay? Are you all right? And yes, I am fine. My mum, who some of you will know has dementia, moved into aged care just maybe a week and a half ago. And that process of having her moved and support my dad and doing all the things around that was exhausting and really challenging. So that was kind of the life stuff that was going on. So that's the update. And that brings us to today. And today we're going to be talking about a guide to self-care for people pleasers and perfectionists. Now, why this? Part of the reason why is because people that I work with will often self-identify as being people pleasers and having perfectionist kind of tendencies. And these qualities are things that I can relate with. I absolutely would put myself into both of those categories. And it's been part of the journey, I guess, or part of the evolution into this SelfKind approach to kind of navigate how do we keep the best of those qualities, I guess, because they are very well-meaning and very supportive of relationships sometimes, without the less wonderful qualities of them, which can sometimes lead us to discard our own needs in favor of pleasing somebody else or, looking after somebody else's needs, or discarding just enough action because it's not perfect or it's not, what we would deem quote unquote enough. And when I work with other humans who are struggling with these things, they don't tend to come to me and say, well, I need help because I'm a people pleaser and a perfectionist. We don't often necessarily identify that that's actually the problem, but what people will come with is exhaustion, overwhelm, resentment, aches and pains in their body, inability to sleep well, feeling kind of just inflamed and uncomfortable a lot of the time. And what kind of then becomes apparent is putting a lot of pressure on themselves because their expectations are really high, not only for their own behavior and what they should be able to do, but also on like the results of that behavior. Or it will become really clear that despite their best intentions and desires even, once there is the call or the pull of somebody else's needs, then they will go and attend to those first. And often that will be at the detriment of looking after their own needs and desires. So I thought, let's talk about this. There's a couple of episodes not too long ago where we dove into people-pleasing and perfectionism. There may be some overlap, but this is really thinking about how do we work with and start to overcome some of those tendencies when they're no longer working for us. So in my way of working, I really only think things are problematic if they're proving themselves to be problematic. And things prove themselves to be problematic if they're getting in the way of how we want to feel, show up, be in the world. And so if these tendencies that we have to please other people first, to put other people first all the time, or our desire for our standards just being super, super high, if that's getting in the way of us tending to ourselves the way we want to, of having the relationship with ourselves that we want, then yeah, we can do something to address that. We're not just like looking to be like, well, what are all the potential things I could like fix about myself, right? It's not about that. It's like, what potentially is getting in the way of the relationship I'd like to have with myself and my body and the way that I would like to feel? And then let's work with that. So what I have today is 4 plus a bonus step or tips around how we can approach self-care and self-love, dare I say, when we have this tendency to please other people or to have this desire for perfection, okay? The thing with perfectionism is I, for a long time, really didn't think of myself as being a perfectionist because I was very much willing to like let things go. But what becomes very apparent when we do have these tendencies to perfection is that we're just kind of hard on ourselves when we don't get things to that particular standard. So it might be that you're very happy to just like, oh, well, it's not perfect, but we're on the inside kind of like, but it should have been. It should have been perfect. You should have done better. You could have done better. You know better, right? That sort of talk. And so when it comes to self-care, that can be a very easy way to fall into, I'm either all in or I'm all out. And when I'm all in, I'm okay. Maybe exhausted though, because I'm trying to do too much. And when I'm all out, then like I'm the problem. Yeah. So let's start with step or tip number 1, which is to understand the values that relate to how you want to be in relationship with yourself. Now, sometimes when I talk about this with others and with clients, it's a bit like you can kind of see their moment of like, oh, what? And if you ask yourself, what values kind of direct the relationships that I have with other people, it's probably a lot easier for you to come up with the words that describe that than the relationship that you would like to have with yourself. Because we know we want to be kind, loving, respectful people to others, right? We know that. We're often very clear on that. We might not call them our values. We might not have like a clear list. But if I asked you, hey, what values direct your relationships with others, or what would you like that to look like? Those might be some of the words, and other words might come up for you, of course. But this idea of love and respect and kindness and compassion, it's often easier for us to think of those as being things that are kind of easy to reflect our external relationships, a little harder to turn them to ourselves. But when it comes to adjusting or nurturing our relationship with self-care, it actually has to start with understanding the relationship that we want to have with ourselves and our body. And if you kind of are sitting there squirming, you're not alone. This is not necessarily an easy thing to do. So I'm going to talk you through a few steps that you can use to start to explore this. It can be interesting. It can be confronting also, but it can be interesting to think, about what words would reflect how you currently relate to yourself and your body. And then to consider, what would you actually like that relationship to look like? There's some resources that are available online that make this a little bit easier. So if you Google values lists, and in fact, I think I even have one that I can put in the show notes. That might be possible. Check in the show notes, see if I've got one there. You can start to go through that list and just read the words, read the values words, and start to see which of these reflect something about the way that I would like to relate to myself and my body. If you're doing it with a list, you can start to write those down or print it off and highlight them. If you have, you can even get like values cards, and you might have access to those. If you work in person with a therapist, or if you came to work in person with me, we would sort through cards. So you can do either. And we just want to look for any word that makes us go, oh, yeah, I like that. That sounds like a nice way to relate to myself. And you might end up with a really big pile, okay? Or a big long list of words. And that's fine. We can start with a really long list. We can start with a big pile. And it's fine if you're like, but I don't know how. I wouldn't know how a kind and compassionate relationship with myself would look. I don't know how to do that. That's okay. It's fine if we're not yet sure how to live those values and kind of create them in our lives. But we want to start to look for the words that reflect, oh, yes, I want that relationship with myself and my body. Okay. So once you have your big list, then we start to look, and we'll see usually that there's some level of overlap between words. So you might have 5 words that all really speak to one thing, and you can pick one of those words that seems to be a little bit more like resonant with you, right? So respect, compassion, honesty, those sorts of words maybe go together to you. Maybe they don't. You might be like, no, respect and honesty are 2 really different things. Totally fine. But you're just looking for themes. You're looking for, how can I kind of take the meat of this and start to whittle it down into fewer words? We're eventually looking to have somewhere between like 2 and 6, 3 and 6 words that relate to the relationship that we'd like to have with ourselves. The reason that we want to have just a few is because it would be nice to be able to remember them. And because often they will encompass other parts, right? So like I said, the word compassion probably could encompass kindness as well, in my mind, although I actually have them as 2 separate ones for me, but either way. And so we want to end up having like just a few words that were like, these really represent the relationship that I would like to have with myself and my body. Again, we don't necessarily have to know how we're going to do that yet, but that will become a little bit more sort of self-evident as we go. So we're wanting to whittle that list down. These might change, right? So as we progress through our life, as we move through our life and even our, days and weeks and months, our relationship with ourselves and our body will change in certain ways. And so the words that we want to kind of use to direct that or to support that might also change. So don't get too sort of fixated on getting this perfect, especially because, if you're listening to this, there's a chance that you have these perfectionist tendencies as well. So we're using this as a bit of an opportunity to be like, don't have to get it perfect. These are just words to help support me moving in a particular direction, right? That goal will be served probably no matter how many words, which specific ones you choose. So we don't have to get really, really nitpicky, but you do want ones that sort of you feel it in your body, right? You feel like, a sense of perhaps exhale, relief, home, softness, warmth. You want them to reflect a feeling that you're aiming for, right? Now, once we have those values, and, probably not doing this in real time, but if you are, you could push pause. Once we have those values, we actually just want to do like a little bit of a reality check in our lives. What can happen when we are, sort of tending to put other people's needs before our own, or we are kind of sort of striving for that all, and then sometimes falling into the nothing parts of self-care? What can happen is that we're chasing an ideal that doesn't fit in with like the reality of our real lives. Okay. Sometimes when we read these, like, You hear people talk about their morning routine, or like the best morning routine for, making $1 squillion, or the best morning routine to have the best possible relationship with yourself and your body. Some of those morning routines are so unrealistic for most of us, but because other people are doing them, we look at them and we go, oh, well, they can do it. I should be able to do it. But we don't know what else is going on for them, right? We don't know what other supports they have. So we want to do a reality check of our life. This is kind of twofold, because there will probably be places and spaces in our life where we have some choices, right? We have some choices, how we spend our time, what we choose to say yes to, what we choose to say no to. But there will also be some things that are just very true and fixed in time. So an example of this is I coach 2 basketball teams, both of my kids' basketball teams, and I play basketball as well. And this is a really joyful thing for me. I love it, and I never expected to love it. It's new in terms of, this is a fairly new activity in my life, but it has become a really interesting part of it for me, a really joy-filled part. Not always. There's moments where it's like pull your hair out, frustrating, but for the most part, it is so fun and I love it so much, and it's really, really rewarding. But the reality of what that makes my life look like is that I'm kind of busy on a couple of days of the week, particularly because I'm preparing for training, I'm doing training, I'm coaching games, I have to be there, all of that sort of stuff. So I want to look at that. I could look at that and someone else could say, well, you don't have to do that, right? You could say no to that. And that is true, but I want to do it. So then I have to take that reality and I have to say, okay, well, the reality is this is what my life looks like. Same with running a business. I have choices within that, but the reality is that also means that, 100% of the work at the moment is on me. So I've created a reality that I want and I then have to respect, right? So we don't want to be setting out to create self-care routines that would require us to quit our jobs, say no to all the activities in our life, and, I don't know, just erase a whole bunch of our calendar. Yes, you have choices of what you say yes and no to. We hear these quotes all the time of we all have the same 24 hours in a day. That's not even true for a start. Yes, there's 24 hours in a day, but they're not equal to all of us, because if you're working 3 jobs, that's not the same as somebody, not working at all, or, anyway, tangent. But we have to be honest about the reality of what our lives look like, okay? Yes, as you take stock, notice if there's things that you're like, oh, I actually want to say no to that, right? Like if I was taking stock of my life and I was like, actually, I don't want to do this coaching, then yeah, I could say, all right, at the end of the season, I'm stepping back. That's not true for me right now, but at some point it might be, right? So we can sort of take stock and kind of see, where can I create space if that is possible and desired? But also just looking at it and going, okay, well, given the reality of what my life looks like, it's probably unrealistic for me to think that my self-care routine needs to start at 5 a.m. and last me 2 hours every single morning of the week. All right. So we're just getting a reality check. We're going, what time do I actually have? Because then what we're going to do in step 3 is determine what our enough is going to be. Or even you can think of this as our enough or our bare minimum, kind of either side of that coin. We want to start looking at self-care as being choices that we can make, truly moment to moment, and being a way of relating to ourselves and our body. Self-care can be kind of viewed as these sort of separate to life activities sometime, right? Like I need to set aside time for my self-care. I truly think that a kind of more realistic way of looking at that for most of us is to be in relationship with ourselves and looking like, what do I need next, right? What do I need next? Those moments of choosing our sort of SelfKind, self-care actions doesn't require us to strip our diary of all of our commitments, right? But it might say, well, that next commitment coming up at 4:00, actually, I need to say no to that, because we're noticing what is going on for us and what is true in the moment. But at the same time, we do want to come up with potentially some idea of something that we can do for ourselves that is our bare minimum way of sort of sending ourselves a little hey, I see you, I love you, I'm caring for you. A little moment of like a little love note to yourself, right? So thinking about like, what's something that I can do for myself that doesn't necessarily take a lot of time. It fits into the reality of my life. And every time I do it, I'm going to acknowledge that that's like a little moment of loving on myself, of caring for myself, of respecting my body, right? So examples of this might be every time I go and make a pot of coffee, I'm going to pause for the amount of time it takes to brew and do some extended exhalation breathing. Or every time I'm waiting for the kettle to boil, I'm going to do, a minute of yoga poses in the kitchen, stretch my legs, or wrap myself in a hug, or stare out the window and look at the birds. It might be, so one of the things that I do is in the evening in bed, I like to give myself a little self massage on my neck and my face, bit of a lymphatic drainage thing. And to me, every time I do that, it's sort of like this, I kind of truly pause and acknowledge, like, I'm doing this because I care about myself, right? I want to offer myself this kindness. So thinking about like, what are those bare minimum moments that you can experience? That's not to say, and it's not because we're trying to make everything super efficient, right? I can fall into this trap a little bit myself of like, okay, well, how do I be efficient with my self-care? How do I be efficient with my whatever? It's not about efficiency for efficiency's sake. What this really is starting to lay down evidence for that relationship that you want to have with yourself. This is how our brains work. It works based on evidence, right? And so it's so easy to keep doing the things that we've always done because our brain has evidence of that thing and it's like certain, right? It's a sure thing. We want to start laying down evidence for this kind, loving, respectful, honest, whatever your words are, relationship that we desire to have with ourselves and our body. How do we lay down evidence? By doing something to show it. And if we can do that in those small moments throughout the day, we're having these like lots of little wins, right? Lots of little moments of like, oh, yes, I do. I am, being in relationship with myself in that way. Yes. Like a little moment of win, right? And so, yes, there's an efficiency element to this as well, but it's not about that really. It's about how do I lay down evidence consistently without it needing to be all or nothing, without it needing to be perfect, without it needing to be me, blowing up my entire life to find the time and the space. So that's step 3. Step 4 is to practice acknowledging the things that you do for yourself, right? And also acknowledging the moments that we choose to move away from the values that we've determined we want for our relationship with ourselves. And let me explain that a little bit. This is self-awareness, ultimately, right? It's understanding, I just chose to push through to meet that deadline, even though I was feeling awful. But you know what? In this moment, that was the needed, necessary thing. That's what felt right to me, even though it knowingly went against how I actually feel. And then meeting ourselves with compassion in that moment when we recognize that, I did probably ignore some of my body's signals there, but it was conscious, right? I moved in this other direction with intention. And also acknowledging those moments of like, oh, wow, I really met myself with kindness then. I really met myself with compassion. I really feel like in that moment I was respectful of my needs. And starting to be able to notice and acknowledge these things as we move through our day. I find this particularly interesting for myself in relation to the people-pleasing stuff. So I recently have been trying to sell things on Marketplace. Facebook Marketplace. Oh, that is an experience. That is just next level. And I came very close to my people-pleasing tendencies in this process. So some of the stuff that we're getting kind of rehoming, a lot of it is my mum's stuff. And my mum was a counsellor and she worked a lot with children in schools, and she has a lot of counselling resources. Now, as a counsellor, I took first dibs on the things, but a lot of stuff just wasn't relevant to the way that I practice. And so I was trying to rehome this stuff. And you get bombarded, right, on Facebook Marketplace, and especially when you're giving things away for free. And I noticed that when I had to say no to people because I'd already given it to somebody else, all of that like people pleasing desire coming up in me and like wanting to over explain, wanting to placate them somehow. And it was a really interesting reflection because in that moment, it was like noticing, oh, I'm kind of giving away something of myself here in this process of trying to please them. I can be kind and I can be clear and I can be direct in my responses without having to like dishonor what was going on inside of me. And so I find the people-pleasing element of this really interesting, even like in a home environment with my children, noticing that sometimes like I might be having a moment of pause and somebody's screaming my name from upstairs. And in that moment, deciding like, which direction do I want to move in? There is no wrong answer, right? But it's being more interested and curious about what am I choosing here? So there are some times where somebody might be screaming my name and I'll just call back like, I'm resting, you need to wait or you need to come downstairs to me. And there'll be other times where I'll just, oh, well, I'm getting up and I'm going to go and attend to whatever it is that's happening. But it's not being pulled and jerked around by those tendencies or defaults, I guess, that we have. It's getting more curious and being like, why am I making this choice, right? And we don't have to do that for all of our choices, but it can become kind of interesting to notice, oh, I'm choosing not to engage in that sort of stretching or movement because I've only got 5 minutes and it doesn't seem like long enough. Oh, there's a little bit of me trying to get it 100% right there. Maybe I could just move for 5 minutes and it will count. Or, that sort of noticing. It's that kind of curiosity that can start to shed more light on some of the choices that we're making, because sometimes it can just feel like we're pulled around by our tendencies, right? Like I'm pulled around by my desire to please other people, or I'm pulled around by my desire for perfectionism. But the reality is there is a moment of choice. Sometimes we miss it though. I know this. Sometimes we miss our moment of choice, but noticing when we choose to move towards those values of how we want to be in relationship with ourselves, and noticing when we move away from them. When we move towards, when we move away, and meeting ourselves with compassion when we move away and we feel like a bit funny about that. Because it's not about the blame and shame game. It's about just that curiosity. We're never going to always get something 100% right. So this is not about becoming a really good self-care person. It's about, again, trying to foster a relationship with yourself that is reflective of the relationship that you would like to have. And that is very different than just trying to tick off the boxes. All right. Step 5 or tip 5 is actually something that we're going to talk about next week. So I'm just going to give you a little teaser. But this is about starting to tune into your body for clues, because our body just doesn't lie. There is so much information that we can glean simply by noticing what we're feeling, sensing, noticing in our body, that can kind of help us to move in the direction that is more supportive of that relationship that we want with ourselves more often. So we're going to dive into a conversation around that next week, so stay tuned for that. But if you've got questions that have come up from this week's episode, please feel free to get in touch. You can find me over on Instagram. I'm at Erica Webb _SelfKind. I'm going to run through just those sort of top level 4 steps again, just so that they're kind of top of mind. So first one was to understand your relationships. That's not what I meant. Number 1, see, we're not going to edit any of this because perfectionism, right? Was to understand the values that reflect the relationship that you want to have with yourself and with your body. 2 was to get really clear on what does reality look like right now? 3 was to figure out what's your bare minimum enough moves that you can be doing to lay down evidence of I do show up for myself. I do show up to support that relationship I want with myself. 4 was to practice acknowledging, your choices, particularly noticing those times that you do align and move towards your values that you want to have with yourself and your body, but also acknowledging the moments when you choose to move away and then meeting yourself with compassion and kindness. We will choose to move away from ourselves sometimes. We will. It's fine. but having that conscious awareness of it is key. And then number 5, for next week, listening in for our body's clues. So I would super appreciate you sharing this with anyone that you think could benefit. And also a reminder, if you haven't yet signed up for the 5-day free Unlocking Shoulder Tension Challenge, that you can just head to the show notes to get the link for that. 5 days worth of movement and self-kindness, compassion delivered straight to your inbox to help reduce shoulder tension and discomfort. I think the URL for that is ericawebb.com.au/shoulders, and the link will also be in the show notes. All right. Thanks for your patience while I took a couple of weeks off there. I will look forward to seeing you again next week. And until then, keep being kind to yourselves.